All right. Well, welcome back to the Living Streams Church podcast. I'm here with you, David Stockton, down in the basement with Dalton running controls, and we got Alec Seekins here, back from baby number 2. And
baby number 2.
New year, new baby. New year, new baby every year from here on out?
It's a little hard to crank them out that fast, but every other year or so, we like having babies. We'll keep doing it.
And we have Ryan Romeo with us.
That's right.
Hey-o.
Back in action after a little bit of a hiatus. He preached our sermon on Sunday on prophecy, which we'll be diving into today. So it's fun to have Ryan back in the studio.
Yeah.
How's your new year been so far?
It's been great.
Yeah.
It's been great.
All 6 days, 7 days, something
Yeah.
like that?
I mean, church world, it's like you're like coming out of, Christmas craziness, but a couple of weeks off, which is really nice and feeling recharged, though a little sick like everybody right now. But
that's going around.
Yeah.
And it's a rough one. The flu I've heard this year is just real brutal.
Just found out my son's puking at home right now.
Oh, no.
Fun, yeah.
Luckily, I didn't get that. It was like the respiratory thing.
Yeah.
But I have been sleeping on the couch for like 2 weeks. I've gotten pretty used to it.
Yeah.
Not because I'm in trouble, just because I keep my wife
even
up.
on Sunday, we were sitting there. I can't remember which service, but it was just a moment where the hack fest began. It was just everybody just started coughing at the same time.
Yeah,
like,
I was telling you guys,
moly.
I mean, between services, I'd come down and cough and get it all out. But
hold it together while you're preaching.
Other than that, great start to the new year.
That's cool. Yeah. Well, and the weather here has just been amazing. I mean, it's too warm for winter, but in some ways, it's just wonderful.
It's so nice.
The perks of global warming.
Yeah,
that's right.
We had a family that we'd connected with from Ireland. You guys actually know Ciprian. We actually had a Zoom prayer call over him where we did some prophetic prayer over him actually while in Ireland, and that was the first time he'd ever interacted with prophetic prayer, and you guys were there with me on that through the Zoom, and he talks about how important that was, which is wonderful. But that whole family, wife and 3 daughters, stayed with us the week after Christmas, and it was really fun having them, but it was so fun seeing them enjoy blue sky.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Lots of it, too.
Not a lot of it in Ireland.
I remember Ciprian just sitting there a couple times just going, oh, this feels so good. Just soaking up some heat and warmth and light and brightness.
A little vitamin D.
They absolutely loved it.
There's a reason the Irish are known for drinking.
Yeah.
It's dark all the time.
Yeah, it's a little gloomy over there most of the year, but they figure it out. So, I thought we'd just jump in. Ryan, why don't you give us a little bit of a recap on the sermon just for the people who aren't listening to this the week after. Maybe it's a little later, but give us a recap on some of the main points of your message and some of the things that, really kind of ministered to you.
Yeah. I think prophecy is so funny because we can make it so mystical, and there's you can't, divorce it from the miraculous nature of God speaking. But Paul is just so incredibly practical with it in 1 Corinthians 14. And it's kind of been I've just kind of recycled the same sermon for years now. But creating that sort of space to say, what is the biblical foundation for prophetic prayer? What are some boundary conditions? Because there are boundary conditions on it. And then knowing those boundary conditions, now let's kind of open it up a little bit. And so there was like part A and B of the sermon, and part A was going through all that practical stuff. It was
so awesome. And it's funny, you said, I've heard you actually do this message multiple times, but the clarity and like concise, it was crisp.
Well, thank you, David. Yeah. Hopefully by now I'm like narrowing it down. But just kind of telling some stories of, kind of the good and bad that comes with prophecy. And then part B was, we've been texting back and forth, and Jameson and Kurt and kind of prophetic voices in living streams that are trusted. And I try to compile it, and I try to pull pieces out. I use just kind of a little bit of discernment to sit down and say, okay, well, what are some pieces that I'm feeling? What are some things I'm going, oh, that really resonates. And compiling stuff from Mario and people like that into something that's a little bit more packaged up.
Just real quick. So Pastor Mario Benavides is the Living Streams Espanol pastor.
Yeah.
And he definitely has spent time honing and crafting a prophetic ability to hear as well as speak in that way. And you had mentioned a couple other people that are living streams that we've just kind of known and tracked with for a while. And so we say, hey, we're trying to hear from the Lord. What's the Lord saying? And Kurt's being some of those.
Yeah.
And then you and I mean, we kind of have our own versions of how we interact with the prophetic gift. But 1 Corinthians 14 says very clearly, we should all eagerly desire this thing.
Yes.
And so even that we've tried to get more eager as years have gone on. Okay, Lord, help me get more eager about this thing, because we've all run into some probably weird versions of prophecy.
Yeah. And I think that's why, I mean, some of the bullet points coming through it were, love has to be the foundation for prophecy. And 1 Corinthians 13, just really laying out what does it look like to love God and love people, and what is the character of love, which is Jesus is the embodiment of love itself. And I think for a lot of people that have maybe had a negative view of prophecy, you might see it through that lens. There's just people that have kind of a critical spirit, and they're trying to prophesy out of that. Church hurt, which happens to everybody because we're humans, but try to prophesy out of that. And but Paul says, pursue love. That's the very first two words of 1 Corinthians 14. Pursue love and earnestly desire the gifts of the Spirit, especially prophecy. And so I think there's a lot of different manifestations of the Spirit that show up miraculously, healing or miracles or things like that, tongues. But prophecy is the one that's like, you see it just throughout Scripture. Anytime there's that sort of thing that goes way beyond human intuition, way beyond what you could just study, and it's something that's saying, this is what God's going to do, kind of like Daniel with Nebuchadnezzar. He's going, I could tell you your dream, and I can tell you the interpretation of it. And the interpretation of it is a prophetic insight for what's going to happen in the future. Even kind of like liberal scholars that try to date Daniel, they will say like, oh, it must be later.
Has to be,
because how could he know, or even Jesus himself, when he's like, the temple's going to be destroyed. When you try to remove the sort of supernatural side of prophecy, then they go, well, this must have been added later, because how could he have known 70 AD was coming? But it really is so foundational to our faith that God speaks, that he speaks ahead of time. He gives us insights into things that are coming. He gives us insight into the inner workings of the heart, which Paul talks a lot about in 1 Corinthians 14, so that it doesn't give glory to people, but it gives glory to God. Because prophecy is one of those things that you're like, how could I take credit for this? You can't. Other than the step of faith and that, maybe that first step to say, hey, maybe God's saying this, that does take some boldness. But if it's true, it can't be you, right? It's gotta be God speaking. And so I think prophecy is one of those things when you're looking at the manifestations of the Spirit, there's a reason why Paul's like, this is one thing that I want churches to be good at. Like, this is one thing that I want you to exercise. And a lot of the things that Paul's talking about is exercising it also in the context of community and the context of Sunday morning.
Yeah, 1 Corinthians 14.
Yeah, and that's why I love, Prophetic Sunday at Living Streams, because it's like we're actually exercising it as a congregation. Because Paul will say, like, only 2 or 3 prophets speak at a time. Nobody interrupt each other. Let them finish. Then sift it out, and there is that one-on-one, and I tend to, those are the kind of stories that can tend to pop up. You're praying for somebody one-on-one, and God does a lot in that. But there's that sort of corporate prophecy, and it's always been the thing, I think, for me personally. Faith Cummings and I have had a lot of conversations about this. Prophetic insight is kind of unique to the person, just a little bit, There are people that that are like, man, I got this verse and I went there. Or there's people that I tend to get kind of like a feeling. And I go, Lord, what is that? Like, what is that sort of sense that I'm feeling?
Yeah.
I even shared that on Sunday, kind of like the Lord of the Rings. Like, something's changed. I could feel it in the ground. I could feel it in the water. And sometimes in especially that sort of corporate or like prophetic insights for what maybe is going on in the world, that's something that I've always felt like the Lord's really spoken to me about, you know? And so I think it kind of manifests itself in different ways, but it's a gift that clearly we should be trying to plumb the depths of.
Well, it's so biblical. I mean, it's everywhere. Obviously, a huge chunk. I've heard people say like a third of the Bible is prophecy.
Yes.
So we should get good at prophecy. I mean, we should really know how to handle prophecy. And I loved what you had said multiple times, just saying, hey, I'm going to speak some things, but it's between you and the Lord to actually figure out what this means and how this applies to you.
Yeah.
Like you have a role to play
Yes.
in discerning this and hearing from this. And it was fun to get all those multiple different words from different people and to have those sitting in front of you. Because I know this is what you were doing for your sermon, but I was just doing it for myself, you know?
Yeah.
And just there were certain things that definitely were like, okay, I feel like I'm supposed to grab onto this. And it wasn't, I want to grab onto this, but it just, this really stood out to me, or this caused my heart to burn within me, which like those disciples said about Jesus's words.
Yeah.
And to grab onto some of those things and kind of synthesize that into my own, okay, Lord, I feel like this is what you're saying. And then to boil that down. I loved that how important it is for the person to discern. And I love you brought out one of my favorite phrases in that passage is when it says that the spirit of the prophet is subject to the prophet.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think it's so fun to have that verse there, because Paul was writing to this church who we're messing it up. We're a little bit out of, and he's trying to bring some clarity, and he's not trying to get rid of it, but he's just trying to bring some order. And because there were people on there who were saying, "Oh, the spirit of the prophecy is on me," and they just start going crazy, and it's like they have no control anymore.
Yeah,
anything I say now, I don't have responsibility for, or my actions, even like speaking in tongues or all these. Where Paul's saying, "Hey, whoa, buddy."
Yeah.
The spirit of the prophet, is subject to the prophet.
You have self-control.
So the spirit is not taking over you and making you do it. No, the spirit is working together with you to bring about something that you could not bring about by yourself.
Yes.
But don't be a weirdo about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I love that even the way, at least in third service, you said something when you were talking about love as a foundation there, and then you corrected yourself, and I actually thought it was a really like seeing you like, and you're so like, that's one thing I really love about working with you and thinking things through is we both care to be very precise with the nuances of the words coming out of our mouths. And in brainstorming meetings are fine flying around, but try to hone it in. And you had said, so I saw that process when you said something like love is necessary for prophecy. And then you said, wait, no, that's not exactly true. Love is incredibly helpful when we're pursuing fruitful prophecy.
Yes.
And I love that correction, because I think knowing you and what you were thinking in theology and the scripture, I'm assuming part of what was behind that was that you realize like, actually you can prophesy not out of love. Yeah. And you can, and that's something that blows people's minds off it often is that the manifestations of the spirit, including prophecy, can be perverted.
Yeah.
We can twist the gifts, which sounds crazy because we're like, wait, it comes from the Spirit of God. How can we twist it?
Yeah.
Well, everything you are and have comes from the Spirit of God.
Yes.
Right. And so God gave you a gift of athleticism.
Yeah.
Nobody in this room other than maybe David, I suppose.
Yeah.
Not anymore.
Hey, you take it easy.
Sorry. Well, certainly not myself. Let me
Dalton
say
was
that.
doing some high interval training.
I'm getting there.
Yeah.
But
Speak for yourself.
But even though God gave you that inclination towards athleticism,
Yeah.
that doesn't mean you can't use your fist to punch somebody else.
Totally.
And if someone
you can
gave
misdirect
you,
it.
if the Lord gives you prophetic insight, you can use that to hurt someone.
Yeah.
It's not because that is information, that is insight that you now have.
Yes.
And you now hold, even though it came right out of the Spirit of God.
Yeah.
And there wouldn't be anything in the world if God wasn't okay with the possibility that we would twist the good gifts He's given us.
Yeah. I think if I was to like precise, like narrow down on maybe what was going on in my head, third service, because I think I didn't say it any other service, but I was like, I think I overstated something just now. And it's that out of a foundation of love is like, that's the best foundation for prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, it's the more powerful version of it.
Yeah.
Though there can be something that happens. I mean, I think there are a lot of people that are very critical, that have prophetic insight, and they share that insight. but it lacks a little bit of power because it doesn't have the love behind it.
Mm.
So I mean, I've thought about this a lot where, maybe you've got an insight, and I've been sensing this for a long time, and I've been seeing this happen time and time again, that I think God is, and I always use this phrase because I think it's true. I think he's lovingly correcting the church right now. I think he's lovingly correcting some leaders in the church right now that are falling. When you see all these major leaders that are so influential, you see these moral failings, all of that. It's so easy with a critical spirit to say, see, I knew they were jacked up. See, I knew that whole thing, as opposed to saying like the leader that fell, I still love them and I would love to see them restored and all of that. And can they say God's bringing judgment on leaders? Well, yes, that's true. But I think it's a lot more powerful when we don't relish in that, because we know, like with humility, with our own brokenness, and loving people in the community helps you to say, I think God's correcting things in the church, and not in that sort of critical spirit, but in that loving spirit of each one of us are humans that he wants to see brought back to restoration. Yeah. And so I think there are a lot of things that I think maybe on its face would feel really negative, like this, like major churches that you're seeing just kind of fall apart right now, or major leaders or influential people. But what it is it's just really unhealthy things have seeped into the church, and God's correcting it. And the loving prophet would go, oh man, it breaks my heart just like it breaks God's heart. And it gives a measure of humility of, oh Lord, let that not be me, or let that not be something that I fall subject to.
According to Jesus, the greatest prophet of all time, right? The one who got it right more than anyone else was John the Baptist.
Yeah.
That's actually what he said. There's no one born of a woman has been greater, prophet than John the Baptist. Yeah. And John the Baptist was said to be someone who was crying out in the wilderness from Isaiah, make straight the path of the Lord. So the prophet usually can see the crooked places better than everybody else.
Yes. Yep.
Then what do they do, right?
Yes.
And I think that's what you're saying is there's different ways to go about calling out the crookedness.
Yes.
And one what 1 Corinthians 13 and then 14 is Paul saying it's got to be done out of love.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise it can be just a noisy gong, or it can actually be something negative.
Yeah.
And so when I think about, and this is a bit what you were saying, Alec, like you can have these giftings. I think a lot of times when I think of politicians, I think a lot of times politicians get into politics because there's something about them that's going, this is a crooked place, and I would like to see this made straight.
Yes.
Yeah.
And somehow it seems along the way they get a little strange or whatever. So I also think there's a lot of songwriters. Actually, I think there's something about songwriting,
creativity,
and poets that it's like, a lot of them can see crooked places. They can feel crooked places, and then they can put words to that. Yeah. So I think about some of the very secular songwriters can sometimes just absolutely nail what's wrong with society, or something wrong with society. I think of Bob Dylan in particular.
Sure.
Yeah.
Like he was always just calling out things that were not right in society. However, not necessarily maybe with love, not necessarily with the Spirit of God and the supernatural reality to then say, here's what we do.
Yes.
But at least being able to call those things out. And the Lord uses voices like that.
Yeah.
But definitely the prophecy that we're seeking after is the one that is, rooted and founded and bathed in love.
Yes.
And actually is attached to the supernatural Spirit of God.
Yeah.
Which can not just call out the problem, but actually bring healing to a problem, or can bring a different.
And if you're
path.
not careful, you could fall into this sort of Jonah trap where you're like, here's the prophetic word, and I actually don't want you to respond to it. I hope you burn, that will always kind of leave you in that sort of like wilderness sort of place, and it's kind of the, somewhat of the curse of the prophetic gifting is a little bit like, okay, I see what's wrong, and it's sometimes, I think for the people that are really prophetic, it's like they could look at the world and go, oh my gosh, I see all the things, I see these things, I've got insight, and it's so frustrating. But keeping that heart for, even Jesus, when he was saying, hey, you're hypocrites, you're whitewashed tombs, those are intense words, but what Jesus's hope was that there would be a turning. Like I'm
repentance,
hoping that you can see how far things have gotten in your life. And I'm hoping that you'll see that this is actually the reality that's in front of you.
Yeah. He died for them just as much as anybody else. Yeah.
I love the way Mario puts it, and to paraphrase him a little bit, but we ought to pursue the fruits of the Spirit before we pursue the manifestations of the Spirit.
Yeah.
And I was even just thinking about this as we're talking a little bit, and thinking about how fruit comes when we abide in the Spirit, when we abide in the Lord. Manifestation comes when the Spirit abides in us.
Yeah.
Both are really good things, but we're called to abide in Him. If we're having a manifestation of the Spirit, that means God's doing His part.
Yep.
Shouldn't be surprised by that.
Yeah.
God tends to do His part. The Spirit tends to show up and do His thing,
Yep.
But if we're having the manifestations without the fruits, we're not doing our part to abide in Him.
And just a
100%.
little clarity on that. So manifestations of the Spirit, in your mind, you're referring to 1 Corinthians 12 in particular, where there's a list that says, the Spirit has these gifts for
Prophecy,
the people of God. And there's a list of, I think, 7 of them there.
Yeah.
And so the manifestations
miracles,
are, it's not something we possess, but the Spirit actually does in and through us.
Yeah.
Whereas, the spirit of prophecy, which is interesting, there's 3 lists, right? Spiritual gifts. There's the Romans 12, which is a little bit more like talents. These are inherent to you.
Yeah. Yep.
Then you've got 1 Corinthians 12, which is more manifestations. Then you got Ephesians 4 with the 5-fold ministry, where these are roles. Prophecy is the only one that shows up in all 3.
All of them, yes.
Where it's like an office, it's a manifestation, and it's like an ability that some people have.
Which is one of the things that I think if I had an hour to talk about it on Sunday, I probably would have dove into that a little bit.
Which we do unpack quite thoroughly in our Explore class.
Yes.
Anybody who hasn't done Explore, coming up pretty soon.
Well, and we have right now. So this is like, I kind of log that away of like, I would like to talk about that in the podcast because there's a kind of capital P prophet, and then there's prophecy that Paul's like, I want everybody to do this, I think there are people, there's kind of these overarching gifts that we carry in the office giftings, apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, teachers. And the more you could kind of see that's like this filter that you're running everything through, We've talked about that even on teaching team. Like Alec is he loves teaching. And I always joke, I'm like, he doesn't care what you do with the information. He's like, I just want to get you information, like,
it's true.
Goki's like, I just want to get you moving. I want you to do something and I don't care what I have to do to make that happen. I think for me, I'm a little bit more of the capital P prophet. So whenever I'm preaching, I've learned about myself, it's best not to hardwire my ending because I need a little bit of that tightrope. Like, Lord, what are you saying right now?
Yeah.
And I think it's just a little bit of the filter that I run things through. And I think that that's been something for people that have the office of prophet. That's where you feel like you're getting insights all the time. And it's just coming out of you all the time. Every time you sit down, every time you watch the news, you're like, oh my gosh, I can sense what God's doing. Sometimes you can't articulate it exactly, but you have that insight. Yeah. And that's where the kind of the tortured prophet, or and I think, musicians, people that are in tune to that sort of thing, it could feel a bit like, man, I don't know. Me and my dad were actually just having this conversation because I actually think my dad's pretty prophetic. And the result of the outworking of prophecy and feeling prophetic insight all the time, a lot of times is pretty lonely because you're kind of going, do you see this? And people are like, no, I don't see that. And you're like, are you sure? It seems so evident to me. And I think I've learned over the years to realize, to value the gifts that God's given me and to go, oh, maybe I need to take 3 steps back and just go, I see this thing, but it's also, what I'm sensing is also built on this and it's also built on this, and not assuming that everybody is in tune in the same way. And I think prophets in the kind of 5-fold ministry sense tend to get frustrated. They tend to leave churches because they're not listening to me, that sort of thing. But again, I think if you're pursuing, just like you said, you're pursuing love, you're pursuing, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, all that stuff adds up to a prophet that has some self-control and understanding the spirit of the prophet is subject to the prophet. I mean, and we've all had this on a Sunday morning. Somebody comes forward, they're like, I got to share this thing. And you're like, well, you don't have to, let me sift it out a little bit. The most mature prophets I know will come forward and say, hey, here's this thing. This is what I'm thinking. You could take it, leave it. You could say it up on stage. You could bring me up. Yeah. It doesn't really matter to me. I just need to share this insight. That to me, I think communicates a maturity in somebody who's probably like a capital P prophet. It's probably like the filter that's like in their life, and they've used it enough. They don't feel like they have to push themselves to the spotlight. They don't have to push themselves in front of people. And sometimes, and I said this on Sunday, sometimes God gives you an insight, and I've had this happen many times where I'm like, should I share this? Yeah. And sometimes it's like, no.
I thought that was beautiful. You said that sometimes you just, like Mary almost, you just hide it in your heart.
Yes.
Yeah. And there will be a time where it makes perfect sense. And what you said, even you told the story of Toby, your son, actually surprisingly prophesying over you in a prayer time that you weren't expecting. And I mean, how beautiful is that?
It was,
But then what he'd said, there were multiple times over that next year where you were able to compare what was happening in your life at that time. Yeah. And that word kind of gave you an anchor as you went through those type of things. And it happened multiple times. So if what didn't happen the next day, or, sorry, Toby, you're wrong, because it didn't happen in a 24-hour period. Yeah. But it was like over the span of a year, the word that he spoke became more and more and more true and more helpful for you as a guide. And that's really what prophecy, it's words of encouragement, edification, and comfort.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so sometimes it's encouraging you to change your attitude towards something or to go for something. Sometimes it is exhortation where it's, a corrective, and then sometimes it's just comfort. It's like, hey, there's no action needed. You just need to know how God's feeling about you right now.
Yeah.
And I love, that's again, 1 Corinthians 14. But I thought you said that so perfectly. Just sit on it for a second.
Yeah.
If you're feeling the Lord speak to you, first rejoice, and then just kind of sit on it and see what comes, and share it. Definitely share it.
Yeah.
Don't declare it maybe right at first, but share it with someone. And I think that's a good deal. And the other thing you would mention, the tortured prophet. We've actually talked a lot about this. Alec and I have over the years, as you look at the office of the prophet in the Bible, right? Yeah. So it is not a fun thing
Jeremiah,
to be
Hosea,
a biblical prophet, right? They all were seeing crooked places in Israel. They would speak out against the crooked places in Israel. And most of the time, the king or the powers that be would put them in prison or shun them or starve them or throw them in a well or just straight up kill them.
Yes.
But whenever the prophet and the king were in line, when the prophet was in line with the Lord and then the king would align with the prophet, the blessing would span the entire country.
Yes.
All of the people would be blessed. Yeah. And that's something that I think for a king, they don't necessarily like to hear the critical voice of the prophet.
Yeah.
They just want to hear how things are good and want to kind of keep pushing. But it can be tedious for them to hear that. But if the king will listen, it'll be a blessing to them, obviously, because it'll be a blessing to all people. Then the prophet sometimes is so annoyed at the king because oftentimes the king's the one causing the problems.
Yes.
But if the prophet can be patient with the king and speak the word to the king and earn the trust of the king, it can be a blessing to that prophet and the whole people. Yeah. But I've always felt like in organizations, whether you're running a business or not, I know this sounds funny, but you will have people on your staff that can see things that you can't see if you're the leader.
Yeah. Yes.
And if you can link together and earn the trust back and forth, you'll make such better decisions.
Yes.
And that's true in a church organization as well.
I agree. Yep.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting in Ephesians 2, not in Ephesians 2, in Ephesians also, is when Paul's saying, Jesus is the chief cornerstone. Mm-hmm. And then the foundation of the church, he said, having been built on the apostles and the prophets. And there's something about, I think even those two giftings in terms of the office giftings are somewhat different. So like the apostle is going to want to grow and go and like build and maybe even create structure and multiply and like they're just going out, Mm-hmm. And then the prophet's going like, whoa, what's God saying though right now, And I think there's a really kind of beautiful thing when you see that tension.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, I think that tension's really important. And there's something really foundational for the church. And I think that prophetic voice, there is a reason why I think it's in all the gifting lists in Paul's writings, is saying that there's prophecy just kind of has to be sprinkled in all over the place. And I think sometimes, sometimes you would call it prophecy, and sometimes maybe on its face you wouldn't. Mark Buckley is a great example. Mark will go, you know what you should do is do this. Or, you know what I think is this. And he wouldn't say hey, I'm saying that God's saying this right now. But Mark has a prophetic gifting and insight that's always proven real right in my life. And he'll say something and you might go, oh, you bristle against it or something. And he wouldn't say it's a prophetic word, but when you've got an ear tuned to the Holy Spirit, you're like, maybe there's something in that, Yeah. And that could happen in the business world. It could happen in the church world. It could happen all over the place.
And I think that's in the list, you got word of wisdom, word of knowledge, in addition to prophecy.
Yeah.
And I always tend to fold in.
Yeah.
A little bit.
In my opinion, I've kind of just folded them in with prophecy, even though we could get to nuance and create distinction between prophecy, word of wisdom, word of knowledge, because Paul obviously did. He listed those three separately.
Yep.
And word of wisdom, to me is kind of knowing what to do in a tough situation. Maybe like Solomon, let's cut the baby.
Yes.
And once he says that, then the truth came out.
Yeah.
So it's like wisdom was knowing how to find the truth.
Anybody doesn't know that story, they're real confused. Right
yes.
now.
Yeah. And the baby doesn't.
You can
get
read
cut
it.
in half,
It's a weird story too.
Yeah, it's a weird story, but it is
King
wise.
Solomon.
Yeah.
It's really, I think, the Bible's quintessential wisdom story, right?
Yeah.
To show that he was wise. This was the story
From the quintessential wise king.
Yeah. And then word of knowledge is not necessarily knowing what to do, but just knowing something you couldn't know without. So I think of the woman at the well, right? Where Jesus is saying, hey, you've had a lot of husbands.
Yes.
And the guy you're with right now does not this is what you should do now with you. This was just a word of knowledge that created a relational connection that Jesus was able to bring the love the love of Christ, the love of himself to.
Yes, his own love, yes.
And then prophecy, I think what we're trying to define is something where you get a bit of the sense of what God is up to in the moment, or what heaven is feeling about a situation. And so that's kind of the way I would create some little nuanced distinction, but most of the time I just say they're all prophecy. They're all wrapped up in there. Discernment even, right? Discernment is another one of those gifts, but seems like if someone's really got discernment, I'll be like, you seem prophetic, right? Because you're able to discern things. But again, those are 4 different lists that Paul's at. So it is funny how I kind of lump them all into this idea of prophecy.
Yeah.
And I think that's just kind of like vernacularly this century charismatic-ish circles. Like that's, which is interesting to me actually, because Paul distinguishes those.
Yeah.
I often say like, man, I wish I could have sat down and heard Paul's teaching on the spiritual gifts. Because what people don't realize is we don't have that.
Yeah.
We have him alluding to it.
Yeah.
And like dipping a toe into it, but like,
well, and he's so unsystematic with every single one of his writings.
Yep.
But when it comes to these things, he makes
it just smells so much as you read the New Testament that it's like he had a teaching. Yeah. And he sat in the room with the church and probably went from church to church. I mean, I'm reading between the lines here.
Yeah.
And he was like, let me tell you about what words of knowledge are and what words of wisdom are and what discernment and prophecy and miracles. And I'm like, please.
Well, what's fun for Paul too is Paul didn't
Yeah.
have a New Testament to base that off of.
Yeah.
Paul was basically doing research on this new thing called the way or the church.
Yeah.
And he was, by the Spirit's giftings, able to discern, hey, it seems like these are things that you want to build the community upon. It seems like these are ways that God shows up in a community.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
maybe even
very
making
cool.
that taxonomy on his own as he's observing.
Yeah.
You know, and obviously, you know, like, you know, I'm sure as you're teaching on the manifestations of the Spirit, you're probably checking in with the Spirit of God a little bit. You know, and we believe
And there's a
some
lot of
inspiration
experiential
there.
things. I mean, as I'm preaching, even I'm like thinking of my own experience with those and the times that I've seen sort of it show up. And
well, when was the first time you interacted with prophecy? I was wanted to ask that question. What was your initial like?
It was probably YWAM. I mean, I think, you know, I think you get into it like an environment like that, and you're about to go overseas, and you're with a lot of people.
Explain the environment a little bit for those that don't
so
know.
YWAM is like it's a very like sort of youth-driven missions organization. It's been around for a long time. Lauren Cunningham started it in the 70s, I think, and it's been going around for a long time. It's last check, I think the second largest missions organization
worldwide for sure.
Yeah, next to World Vision, but it's an interesting environment because nobody's paid to be there. Everyone's raising support. So there's this sort of passion level that's automatic. Now there's kind of maybe some freeloaders in there. There's always some of those. But for the most part, people are like, I'm here not because I have a salary, but because I want to be here and I'm called here. And then it kind of came out of like an Assemblies of God background with Lauren Cunningham. And when he started YWAM, had a vision of like waves of young people going to the nations.
That's awesome.
And so that's like kind of it's in the DNA of YWAM. And I think that was the first time. I mean, and Joel and I, had talked about it. I got saved in high school.
Your
Joel,
best friend for a long time.
Yeah, your cousin.
Yeah,
Yeah,
my cousin.
Good friend of mine. And he introduced me to Jesus and Scripture and all of that. But I think in YWAM, it was like the first time that I'm going, oh, God could give you vision. God can give you dreams. God can speak to
God's
you about
got a plan
person
for your life right now.
Yeah. And that sort of interactive, like you can hear from God right now and you could share that with somebody and you could see something happen from that. And so I think we were going through a prayer walk. I think it was one of the first couple of months that I was there. And we were praying for an area and we felt like we kind of had a prophetic insight for that. And it's funny, coming from kind of a non-church background, I was like, this is kind of weird. Like, is this like new agey sort of stuff?
Yeah.
And I didn't even, I mean, at that time, I don't think I was even like scared of that because I just didn't have any context at all. I'm like, this just feels so odd. And then I had like a couple of prophetic things that happened there. And I think when I started to see that it was really beneficial for the group, when I really started to see God would give somebody an insight that would line up with somebody's insight, kind of like what we did this last Sunday.
Yeah.
I started to go, this is not just weird mysticism, or trying to like muster up some sort of weird performance. Like God's actually doing something here. And so I can't really pinpoint the exact first story, but I think it was just being in that environment really spoke to me in terms of what prophecy could do. Yeah. And then kind of in the coming years, I think for some people, like that step of faith in evangelism, step of faith in different things, I've often had a lot of moments of steps of faith with God when it comes to prophecy, where it's like, I want you to share with this person that thing. And I'm like, oh man, like I told the story last year of God going, I want you to go tell that guy with a bunch of tattoos that he's going to be a better dad than his dad was. And I was like, wow. All right, Lord, like number one, who knows if he's a dad? Number two, maybe he had a great dad. I don't know. Maybe that's like offensive to him. Like, I don't know. There were so many reasons.
What if he's got a knife?
Yes. Yeah. There's so many reasons it could have gone south. And it just like opened him up, and he started crying. He had some family around him who were praying for him. And so I've just kind of seen time and time again, when you take that step of faith and say, maybe God's saying this thing, that he shows up in power. And then I remember in that story, even in particular, I shared the word. Then as the family, they all started talking and praying over each other. And I just kind of slowly like backed out. I was like, bye, because I wasn't needed anymore. And they didn't need to know who I was or my name or any of that. Didn't matter. It was just that God all of a sudden showed up in their midst, and then they took it from there, Cool. And so I think that's kind of been my experience with prophecy, and I've just seen it reinforced over and over.
So what about you, Alec?
It's hard to tell because when I was a kid, so I'm 9 and 7 years younger than my siblings. And so when I was a kid, my sister was a part of, was one of the founding leaders of something called Sacred Edge in the Valley. That was like a youth-led revival, prayer, very charismatic, worship time, prophetic. thing that was kind of like a Phoenix manifestation of like what was going on in Colorado Springs at the time at New Life Church, and Cindy Jacobs and Lou Engle and all the calling and right, the calling is that? The calling is what we do. The call is what it was.
Yes,
it was kind of like the Phoenix manifestation of that. And there's a lot of really good stuff in there, but that's a good example of like kind of what you were warning about a little bit on Sunday of like it can get weird unnecessarily. So in that bubble, and that bubble still exists, we have people who know and love Jesus, who insert a lot of their own weirdness.
Yeah.
And also create environments where people are going to fake manifestation of the spirit. Now I'll tell you, it's not all fake what's going on in there. We have people who actually know the Lord, Spirit actually shows up, and it's just messy, and there's not a lot of paying attention to Paul's order in 1 Corinthians.
Yeah.
And
where you're talking about just in the church in general?
In the kind of that prophetic
world.
Super charismatic-y bubble.
But you're not talking about
world.
the calling. You're not talking about
I'm
living
talking about
streams.
no. I'm talking about
in the
something else
sense.
called the call that happened in the 90s.
Oh, okay.
That's not the calling.
And I think it was Lou
outside
Engle.
of with Lou Engle, Cindy
Yeah.
Jacobs,
So in that
all those
specific thing,
people,
there was a mixed bag.
and Sacred Edge was in that bubble, was the Phoenix version of that bubble, and a lot of really good, powerful stuff was happening in there. But my point in saying is a little unclear. Is it's weird for me because my introduction into the prophetic and that part of a walk with the Lord was mixed in with was genuine move of the Spirit, mixed in with a bunch of people are faking it.
Yeah.
But also and then some people like this is the Lord's really doing something here, but this is way weirder than it needs to be, because there's a weird ego thing that happened. I think a lot of weird move of the Spirit is something strange that our ego is doing, because it's like if it's weird or more, there's more focus on me and my giftings and my power. Even though all those people tend to know it's about Jesus, and I think they
would
mean
say
it.
that.
And they would say, and I would,
but they like the increased attention.
They would mean it, but something that most people in ministry, not everybody has. I'll say this for me, preaching on a good day, and I'd say as I get older, it's more common, more often than not, is about the Lord and His church and building it up. Mm-hmm. But there is a very real thing in my heart where preaching is about me, and standing in front of a bunch of people, and everybody says, "Ooh, you're smart."
Yeah.
And that's a struggle that I think as I move and grow in the Lord, like the Lord wins out in that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to go that way.
Well, and
it could become all about me.
Yeah. You have to fight. Yeah,
and I think in a very charismatic circle, the prophetic has that temptation even more so. Mm-hmm. Bringing a prophetic word, I think there's mixed motives there. And it's like, I want to bring a word for the building up of the church and for the glory of God. But also, I feel cool when I do it. Mm-hmm. And the weirder I am, the cooler I feel.
Yeah.
And it's more nuance than that, but but that's a part of it. And so for me, my introduction to that was in that. So it's hard for me to tell where was the first, wow, the Lord is speaking prophetically versus like, this is just what everybody's doing.
Or whatever.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you, as I grew and matured, I began to realize that's not legit. But this is legit. I began to realize like there's, and that's why if you know me, I'm pretty passionate about like, let's maintain these boundaries, because I hate the fact that people are going to see people making it weirder than it needs to be or faking it and forcing it. And then they're going to say, this isn't real.
Yeah.
And I was interacting with both at the same time. And so fortunately I never discarded the Spirit of God because I saw the power of God, but I know so many people who've done that.
Right.
And so I hate it. If you're faking it, man, I'm like, I want to leave room to learn and to make mistakes. That's important. But I don't ever want to see an environment around here. Unfortunately, that's just not the norm here at Living Streams, where people are being encouraged to force it and to fake it. And I don't like that.
That's why I use that word a lot, performative.
Yeah.
It's not a performance. And I think that, I think I've even experienced that a little bit, where I'm feeling prophetic and I'll have people go, like, you should go for it. And I'm like, what does that mean? What, go for it? What, do you like, get louder or more intense? And And I'm like, I tend to be pretty prophetic, but I'm also mellow and introverted. So I'm kind
You're
of
also
like,
Ryan.
yeah, this is who I am. And I think that's, when you get into those circles, it's easy to say, and that's why I was a little more snarky. It's funny. Sometimes you preach a message and I think like wake up in the middle of the night and I'm like, why did I say that? And I did that last night. I was like, why did I say that thing about being ticky? Because it was a little bit of a shot across the bow to like the Lou Engels and it was more snarky than I meant it, because Lou Engle might just be like that, and that's just like how he is.
I don't have a lot of bad things to say about Lou Engle.
And I'm not, and I don't either. And I'm like, I think there's a lot of real genuine things going on with him. But then the danger with everyone around him starts to become, well, that's what I have to do. Mm-hmm. And that's what becomes celebrated. And that's what becoming prophetic looks like. And I think it's one of those things that my wife and I, we're so funny because we, for whatever reason, love to watch these shows on Netflix about like cults. I don't know why. We get sucked into it. We're like, oh my gosh, it's so interesting. And I'm like, and I find myself like, Blake asked me one time, she's like, well, what's different about like church than this? Because some of it you're like, it's real close to church, it's real close. And when I first got saved, my parents were like, did you join a cult? But I think the real difference is it's that we're not following, like we are following a person, but it's Jesus. So we're not following that leader and going
a personality.
Yeah, that personality. And I think that's sort of like, and I think this is what the Lord's been doing recently. And I've said this a lot, breaking that sort of personality driven cultures in churches where, I get saved and I need to be prophetic and I need to wear these clothes and I need to do this thing and I need to talk like this. And that's what's celebrated. But the beautiful thing about following Jesus is as you follow him and get more in tune to his voice, you get more unique, not less unique, And I think that is something, there's a reason why Christianity is the only religion that talks about spiritual giftings and says that there's even some sort of diversity of giftings in the church. And then even the more nuance of what I was just saying earlier about some prophets are like this and some prophets are kind of like this. And you have to kind of be in tune to somebody and you have to know them to know, you're prophetic, but you don't do it quite the same way as somebody else does it. Mm-hmm. And it's always been a little bit of my struggle. Like, do I need to like perform more or do I need to get louder or crazier? And or even with preaching, it's the same thing. Like, who am I trying to emulate? Or, but the better you become at preaching, the more you're like, this is who I am, and I'm okay with it. You could like it or not like it.
Yeah, that guy,
and that's who I am.
What was it in Acts? I'm gonna say maybe 8 when Philip went to Samaria and a revival broke out, people were receiving the Spirit and speaking in tongues. Yeah. And it was this neat thing, and reports got back to Jerusalem, and they decided to send, I think it was Peter and John or something like that, to go and kind of check it out and to put their hands on people and pray that they'd receive the Spirit. So it was kind of this, like, let's go check and make sure and put some maybe boundary conditions on this thing. Yeah. And so they come and they meet this guy, Simon, who's Simon the sorcerer, is what the Bible calls him. And he's basically trying to buy. He's like, can I buy whatever it is you just did? Yeah. Because I like that when you put your hands on those people, they started to manifest something cool. And I would like to have that because he's Simon the sorcerer, because he's basically built up this personality, this following, persona, this power where these people come to me for this, and I like the way that feels. Yeah. And if I can add what you have to this, then more people will come to me for what, and it makes me feel good. Maybe it made him money or whatever it was. And Peter is just, he's not happy. He basically almost curses the guy. Yes. And basically saying no, because right at the very first time, right at the very beginning, what you're talking about, that Spirit was trying to come in and be and capture that for personal gain instead of glory to the Lord. Yeah. And that's something that we always have to fight against, but that's what's beautiful about having the scriptures. Yeah. And for me, by God's grace, I was introduced to I think we've all basically said, how we were introduced to spiritual gifts and manifestations, and prophecy being one of them.
Yeah.
But you in YWAM, that has a biblical framework for that.
Yeah.
But because it's youth, can be a little messier
It's a
maybe
little
than
unwieldy.
others.
Yeah.
For you, Sacred Edge, who I think maybe wasn't applying biblical framework as strongly as now you would have, looking back, you wish they would have.
Yeah.
But I was at Applegate Christian Fellowship in a small town in Oregon. And in particular, there were these Sunday night celebrations. They did it every other Sunday night. It was just a worship night. But they would actually, in this, there could be hundreds of people there, and they would say, we're going to wait for the moving of the Spirit. And they would read 1 Corinthians 12 to say, this is what we're doing. Nothing else. This is how it fits. We're asking the Lord to do whatever he wants according to his word. And there were a lot of real clear structures put to that. And it blew my mind. I was 17, 18 years old, and people would say things that just resonated in such interesting ways. Someone would speak in tongues, and then they would say, okay, well, the scripture says we need interpretation now, so we're going to wait for that. And sometimes there would be interpretation, and it would be pointed towards God, because all tongues in that context are pointed towards God. They're not. And sometimes someone would speak a tongue, and you would be like, okay, and everybody waiting, and then someone would say, I feel like the Lord's saying this to us. And the guy would say, well, that's not an interpretation of the tongue, because you're directing that towards us, and tongues are only directed towards God. That's what 1 Corinthians 4. So we're still waiting for this tongue. And it was just the way that I was like...
And there's always that middle ground that's so beautiful.
It was awesome. And the very last phrase of 1 Corinthians 14 is, let all things be done decently and in order. So there was... what he was doing with the structure was not trying to limit or squelch. But it was trying to actually free up and protect what the Spirit was doing, so we didn't get into strange spirits or anything. And I just thought, that is incredible. So that was my introduction. So it's funny, that's what I've always tried to bring, is like, let all things, like we eagerly desire manifestations of the Spirit. But we want it to be done decently and in order. And like you said, 1 Corinthians 14 lays a lot of that order out so perfectly for us.
And there's a little bit of what I was talking about in the beginning, the sort of sensationalism versus cessationist, sort of theology. And the sort of, I don't know how to say it, like highly reformed bros that are like coming in going, like, we're going to kind of restructure scripture so that we remove all the mystery. And you're like, that just can't happen, And then there's the people that are just like, doesn't matter whatever the Spirit's doing, it's right because we feel like it's right.
And if I have one verse that points anywhere near that, then I'm good.
Yes, exactly, totally. And I think that's like we saw that a little bit when we were in Portland, the Holy Spirit conference. I still think was so impactful for me. Up in
Bridgetown,
Church. And that sort of matter of fact. I mean, I still remember that guy that was speaking, and he was like, "Hey, there's a girl. She's this age, is kind of asking the Holy Spirit. She's going through this, blah, 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 blah." And this girl starts crying, and she's like, "It's me." And he's like, "Hey, if you're around her, just pray for her, And then he's like, "All right, well, lunch is coming up soon." It was like, it was a very matter of fact sort of, and nobody would remember that guy. Like, I don't remember his name. And I think there's something really right about that it felt so normal that it was like, we're operating in the giftings. We understand the biblical, like, boundary conditions. And then we're going to exercise it regularly so that it feels really normal. And it's not a performance, and you're not trying to, I don't know, say things with a certain intonation and volume and all of that. None of that's important. What's important is hearing what the Spirit is saying to the church.
And having the courage.
And having the courage to do it.
To throw that out there. Because like you said, with the guy with the tattoos, that was, there was, potential danger. I mean, probably not tons there.
Social danger. I didn't want to do it at all.
But there was definitely potential of, I got this wrong. I look stupid. But then to do that in a room with 1,000 people in there is like a whole nother level of, this is my credibility on the line in some ways. But I think having the courage to do it is really important.
Well, and the courage comes from understanding that it's not your credibility on the line, but God's. And so then when there's that sort of like, and when you're in a community that's loving each other, that's why I said it best manifests in a community that loves each other and that's unified. I mean, Paul says that for consolation, building up the church. For a church that has grace and says, there's a reason why you should sift it out when somebody shares on, from in front of a church.
Yeah.
And that means that person has a little humility and saying, I think God's saying this and I could be wrong.
Yeah.
And the church goes, okay, well, maybe he is saying that. And we're really open-handed about it. And we're not judging each other and we're not trying to sift the motivations of the person. And the more that a community is loving one another, preferring one another above themselves, the more that sort of culture is seeped. When the prophetic's added into that, then it's this beautiful thing where you go, I think God's saying this. And somebody could stand up and go, holy crap, that's me,
Yeah, and you had mentioned preaching. So, and even, to affirm some of maybe our brothers and sisters that would say they're more reformed and all those things, they would say that, every time we read God's word, we're reading prophecy. Mm-hmm. But they're just saying,
no doubt.
I just don't think people should say, the Lord told me this, and it be outside of scriptures. They're like, well, just the Lord has already told us what he wants to tell us.
Yeah.
And I think for us, we're saying, I hear what you're saying, and we try and filter. When I say, I feel like the Lord told me this, I usually try and find a scripture that will just say the same thing, because then I'm in real safe ground, right?
Totally. Yeah.
Or at least a script or a few scriptures that actually do confirm what I'm saying in this context. And you did that, 100% in your message, and even the people who, like Mario's was just Joel 2. He was like, basically Joel 2 is speaking this to me.
The latter rain, yeah.
And so I think what they're saying, I would agree with that. Yes, every time I preach, every time I teach the scriptures, I'm operating in some sort of, prophetic role in bringing the truth of God, an inspired word of God, into practical humanity.
Yeah,
no doubt about it. But then we're saying we believe that there is actually more. Just like God spoke to Abraham, who did not have a Bible.
Yeah.
God still speaks to us.
Well, and what Paul is comparing and contrasting in 1 Corinthians 14 throughout the whole thing is with tongues, which is interesting. And I think that's one of those that, especially kind of maybe in the Reformed thought, it's like, well, they were speaking in other languages, like human languages. But I kind of sneakily, I was emphasizing words on purpose on stage.
I caught it, yeah.
But no, the one who speaks in a tongue speaks not to men, but to God, for no one understands him, and he utters mysteries in the spirit. And when he said tongues of men and angels in 1 Corinthians 13, he's laying out a foundation for saying there are tongues of angels. There are this sort of thing that is pretty wild. And the one thing I do love, and I've experienced this as somebody who speaks in tongues, the one who speaks in a tongue builds up himself. Mm-hmm. But the one who prophesies builds up the church. Now, Paul's saying there's kind of a lesser gifting here, which would be tongues. And he's pretty clear about that, But it is interesting in times where there's been multiple times before I preach or something, I'm like, I feel stuck. Or something just not right. And I don't know if it's a prophetic insight for the room or if I'm just stopped up emotionally, spiritually, something. And I'll speak in tongues. And 9 times out of 10, I'll speak in tongues and something breaks. And I go, I just edified myself somehow. And I don't know what I said, but the Lord knows.
Yeah.
And so there is just this, you can't escape the wild nature of the Spirit. And as long as there's a high value for the Word of God, as long as there's a high value for understanding the rules, and we're really clear on them, and we're not adding to the rules or anything, that's not quenching the Spirit. That's not doing anything. We're just doing things orderly and matter-of-factly. I think that's so important to be natural with the giftings. But there's just this little piece of it that you're like, it's also wild. And it's also the Spirit could do something here that we don't understand. But that's what he does. That's where he adds his piece, and it can't be attached to any of our names. And that's what's so beautiful about it. It's only him,
That's cool.
Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah, I think just kind of, the last things here is then, your specific word for 2025, right?
Yeah.
And you had some things that we should be wary of.
Yeah.
Then you had some kind of, things you were sensing God said, and you said, be wary, be simple, expect the latter rain, and resist
sensationalism.
Sensationalism.
Or sensuality.
That's a good thing.
Yeah, you should resist that too.
And you can, I mean, this message is, Ryan's message will be on, all of the Living Stream stuff, YouTube, podcasts, all of that stuff. So you can hear all of those things. But I mean, I think, each of us can kind of share a little bit just as we're going personally, going into a new year. It's not like God honors our calendar, of today.
Mm-hmm.
Like God's saying, okay, now I'm ready for, like, it's not a new year for the Lord, right? It's just, he's the eternal now.
Yeah.
But I think for us, we are seeking the Lord for some direction and insight differently maybe than we do in April or whatever. Yeah. So, and what is kind of a synopsis, basically a little bit of what you're sensing, and Alec, you can share and I can share.
I think, I was, anyone who's preached on stage, I was looking at my clock going, I don't have a lot of time. So I tried to summarize my prophetic word in a few minutes, as best I could. I think in general, I'll say this, the prophetic words that I've been getting and what I'm sensing, it feels genuinely hopeful. Like it feels genuinely like there's some wind at our back this year. It genuinely feels like the Lord is wanting to move, especially in America, I think, in a unique way in this year. And that we should be a people that really expect that we should have that sort of expectancy. The pause I have before I get there was, in a lot of ways, I think we were holding our breath coming into the election. We're holding our breath coming into, inauguration. Now I guess we're, 10 days away. Just because we've seen a lot of division and a lot of, difficulty that's happened, the last 4 years from that. Yeah. And I think we were kind of holding our breath. And the one thing I'd say is to just be careful that we don't feel like the wind's at our back because politics is going okay, or, or for people who love Trump, like, hey, he got in. And I'm like, it does not mean that he's going to solve all the things you think he's going to. And people who hate Trump, it doesn't mean he's going to destroy everything you think he's going to. Like there's a middle ground there. But I think to kind of separate ourselves from the emotions of the politics and just say, God, what are you saying right now? I think it is genuinely hopeful. The first word that I had though was to be wary. And I think there are so many voices that I feel like the danger right now is there's a lot of voices that are almost right. You could listen to a podcast and go,
spirit of error. Yeah, you talked about that.
The spirit of error, I think, was something that I really started honing more and more in. The spirit of the Antichrist, I think we understand that. Anything opposed to Jesus, we get that. Like that sticks out to us. The danger for believers are the people that are almost right. And they're almost Christian, and they're almost, and I think we have to be so careful to say, well, I agree with that, but I don't know about that, and so discernment, I think, is still so needed. I think we're in a continuation of the apocalypse season, which is just kind of my own language. Is a little bit of like, not meaning, end of days. It could be, I don't know, any point.
Not destruction of the world necessarily.
No, that would be like like people conflate it with like Armageddon. They're different.
But that doesn't mean Ryan doesn't have a bunch of canned food in his basement.
It doesn't mean I'm not prepared. It doesn't mean I'm not prepared a little bit. Christians can be prepared. And they should be. But I think it's a continuation of this feeling of like, and we've seen that things when you just like what I was talking about, church leaders falling, things coming out about politicians, things coming out about institutions that we thought were fine, and maybe they were more infiltrated and more evil than we thought they were. All of that is serving to disconnect us and pull our root system out of trusting those and putting it back in the Lord. For the sort of casual Christian, this will be really hard because it's going to be like, well, I trusted this, like I'm American and I'm Christian, it's like, but that sort of hoping in the institution is going to get really difficult. And there's going to be some disappointment in that, maybe you have high hopes for this next season and it doesn't happen the way you think. So you just have to be, and I read the verse, Jeremiah 17, 5 says, cursed is the man who trusts in man and make his flesh his strength. We have to be real careful to make sure and be wary about the voices that we're listening to. And I think obviously more time in scripture is helpful. More time in church is great. Like wherever we can kind of reorient our minds and put our eyes back on the Lord, the better. That spirit of error is something to just be careful of. Maybe somebody gives a speech and, you've got these, we've talked about this guy before. I love him. Jordan Peterson's a great guy, but he's a good example of, you could listen to it and go, gosh, it's almost right. Like there's a little piece there that's, man, it's so true. And there's a lot of truth that's mixed in there, but what's God say about that? What does Jesus say about that? So voices like that to just be, to hold a little bit at arm's length. Being simple to me is not being simple of mind, but, reminding ourselves that following Jesus is a pretty simple thing, and coming back to the roots of like, I want to be more like Jesus. What habits in my life are forming me more like Jesus or away from Jesus? And coming back to a little bit of simplicity, I think for churches too, in general, it'll probably serve well to come back to some foundational pieces and go, let's not forget this, So prayer life, discipleship, discipling others, things that we know we need to be doing that are pretty simple, that are very biblical, but a lot of us have been just maybe too busy to do it, and we've put it on the back burner. Or even those of us in the church going, gosh, I kind of do that, but like coming back to, am I really doing it though? Like, what does my walk with Jesus look like right now personally? And coming back to kind of simple foundational pieces. The latter rain word was when Mario shared about the latter rain, I thought, gosh, there's something about that. And I read the details of what he said, and I think a lot of the details of what he said were really true. He was saying, just kind of unexpected blessings this year, financially, things like that. I'm like, great. I think for a lot of people, maybe that is something that the Lord is going to be doing in the latter rain. But I felt it really necessary to give kind of like a quick little, back end of that verse of saying, in the kind of agricultural society, you'd get rain in the wintertime before you would plant, and it would establish the soil for you. And then you'd kind of go through the winter, and then you would plant in the spring, and you would hope for that latter rain to come and establish the seeds that you planted. And that would start to yield the crop later on in the year. Yeah. I felt like there was, and this is probably about as close as I've ever come to saying something like this, but I felt like something between that former rain and that latter rain. I think there's some sort of event or something that happens that sort of jars people, that maybe makes them a lot less reliant on the world. And I don't know if it looks like a economic issue. I don't know if it's a terrorism thing. I don't know what it is. I mean, it could be a myriad of things. But I do think, and it's not a word of fear, but it's like there's something that happens that causes people to be really hungry for the Lord. And not that we don't tell people about Jesus now, none of that, but when that moment comes, that's when Christians need to be like, now's the time. Like, and I felt that, I think I even had a little bit more clarity after Sunday in that. It's like, whatever it is, not that we're waiting to tell people about Jesus or waiting for the fruit, because God brings fruit and all of that all the time. But like in that moment where the world is like off kilter, we step in and we go, we've got a kingdom that never goes off kilter. Like, and I've been kind of saying something similar for the last few years, and there's been a lot of those moments that are really important. But I don't know if the West has gotten to that point where they understand the fallacy of trusting in man quite yet. I don't think, and you see throughout Scripture, all those sort of little moments where it's like, well, now we see it. Now we feel it. And so for the Christian that's like strong and we're spending time with Jesus, that sort of thing should not throw us off kilter. That should be the moment where we like kick into gear, like we're ready to pounce and go and tell my invite as many people as I know to come to church. And maybe this event causes people to come to church more. I don't know what it is. And like I said, this is kind of the first time I've ever said something that pointed. But I do sense that. But I think in general, what it is like whatever that thing is that causes that desperation, that's when your word about the fruit coming easy makes so much sense to me. And I'm like, I think so. Because people are not going to be coming to Jesus because we were so articulate on Sunday morning and had a really great social media strategy or any of that. It's because they are genuinely at the end of their rope and they're going, I need Jesus. Like I need something different that's not working anymore. Yeah. And I think that's the great opportunity that we have in 2025. And I do think I wrote kind of a simple line where I said, our family is going to grow. And I just think that the family of God is going to grow in 2025. I really do. And so coming into that, my resist sensationalism, I think, is a little bit more of a word toward churches, but kind of in line of all the things we were just talking about when it gifts of the Spirit and all of that. But resisting that desire to build kingdoms on ourselves and on personalities and going, what we really need to do is we need to push people into apprenticing under Jesus and doing that really well. And I think that's that sort of like caution for those of us who love Jesus. Like we don't need to get sensational and we don't need to get crazy. We just need to be when the fish come into we got a net full of fish. Like we just have to catch them and do a really good job of pointing them to Jesus. Like don't come to me, go to Jesus. Like that is, I think, really important for churches moving forward. So that's kind of, I think, a little bit more of an exploded view of what I was talking about on Sunday.
Yeah. Sure. You have a sense, a summation of what?
Yeah, I mean,
putting on.
And it's not new. I've been saying it for a few years now, but I really feel a strong sense of this long stretch of time is for building things that last. It's for long-term goals. So even I hear and feel a sense of, former rains and latter rains, and you talk about casting nets out on all sides and stuff like that. And, when you have a bumper year for your crops, right? When you have, when it was a good year, because any farmer will tell you there's good years and there's bad years. And then there's crazy good years, right? When that happens, there's two things you have to do with a bumper year. One, or two things an abundant crop will force you to do. One, it forces you to be generous. Anybody who's got a fruit tree in their yard that is established knows, like, you got to be generous, but that stuff just rots.
Lots of free citrus right now.
Yeah, exactly, right? You see that all around the valley, especially Central Phoenix, right? It used to be, years ago was orchards, bags of free citrus sitting out on people's lawns, right? So it forces that. The other thing it forces you to do is to create something that lasts, right? So I think of, like the book of Exodus and Pharaoh's dreams and Joseph's interpretations, and then his subsequent advice saying, hey, there's going to be 7 years of abundance, 7 years of famine. So right now we're coming up on the 7 years of abundance. Let's build some storehouses, and so that's 7 years out. They were rolling in it for 7 years. Meanwhile, they're building these massive storehouses in preparation for years of famine. And that did a lot, to say the least. And I feel like I hear those words and it just confirms what the Lord's been telling me for a few years now of like, what are we building for 40 years from now? We just celebrated our 40th anniversary. And for a couple of years, I've been feeling the Lord say, like, build something for 40 years from now. Build something that will be here 40 years from now. And so practically the things I've begun to sense the Lord means when he says, like, hey, plant a tree now. As you plant a tree, it's a seed now, and in 10 years you get some fruit from it. In 20 years, you're rolling in the fruit, right? So a couple of things I feel like that. One, I feel like, and I shared this with you with All for One, the ecumenical ties to our neighbors, to our brothers and sisters down the road. We're in the Central Corridor. It's Church Central for Phoenix, right? And so to say to the churches that are right next to us, like, hey, like, let's be brothers and sisters, because at some point in time in the near future, over a new city, you guys might stumble and need your buddies right here to come pick you up.
100%.
At some point, Living Streams might stumble and need to go talk to Noe at North Baptist and say, hey, can you help us out? Like, we're right here. If we're talking in 40 years, it's every one of the churches in Central Phoenix is going to stub their toe at least, but we're probably all going to break our leg at some point in time in the next 40 years. And realistically, a number of them will disappear. And that might be okay and in the Lord's plan, but it also might be a failure to build stability and to hear what the Lord is saying now about building for 40 years. So I think that's a big part of it. And I think the stuff you were just hitting on of like, how do we build a structure of life that is sustainable? So next time there's something like a COVID, we're not all so flimsy that a third of us disappear from the church and fall off the map. That we can weather that kind of stuff. And because I think COVID exposed some flimsiness in the church. I think we lost a lot of chaff. It was really sad. It stirred up a lot of good things. We've got a new infusion of life in the church. But COVID, I think, exposed the fact that we had built something way flimsier than the bride of Christ ought to be in some regards. And so here we are 5 years removed from it. And the temptation that I feel as much as everybody else is we'd like to get over it, pretend it didn't happen, just laugh when we're sick and say, oh, it's COVID or whatever, but there were lessons that we need to remember. That we learned, not least of which is how important it is to go to church. And yet, are we attending church every month, every week out of the month, like we did 30 years ago, 5 years post-COVID, after learning how important it was? No, we're not. No, we're not. So, anyway, that's my hope, is that we would actually have, like, that when we say church is family, it would be true, and that we would restructure our lives within the church so as to resist the pressure of the society in which we live, the things about it that are distracting and broken, that we would have a robust church, that in 40 years from now, it'll feel like we're just getting started. And we'll have these massive silos that will have filled up, because between now and 40 years from now, we'll have more than 7 years of abundance, and we'll have more than 7 years of famine.
Well, and this is something, I'll just expand on that a little bit, because I think you and I have been pretty unified on this too. It's like, I've used the phrase like a deep root system, but like in my mind, I think churches, used to, and I think they still do, but it's like we celebrate numbers, we celebrate, these things that you're like, money, numbers, personality. These are things that we're like, this is what defines a church, But I think in this next season, and this comes in that like long-term goal, it's like, are we discipling people genuinely? Like, are they genuinely life-changed, becoming like Jesus? Are we discipling the next generation really well? I mean, I think so many of the next generations fallen through the cracks, and we were kind of limping along going, oh, okay, in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, we're going to feel the fruition of that if we don't right now start discipling our kids really well. And I think all of that creates that stability and longevity, and not just filling the storehouses financially or whatever it is, but filling the storehouses with like spiritually deep people who are like, I'm resilient and I could go through something because I genuinely love Jesus. And at any point, like if anything happens, I am just fine. And I think that was what the flimsy nature of what we saw is there weren't as many of those as we thought or we had hoped. So
I'll add one little practical to what you even just said too, is like, are we discipling the baby boomer generation? Because I think one, and this is by far not true of all baby boomers. One really sad thing that I think has become apparent in the last half decade is that the baby boomers are not as, again, not all by any stretch of the imagination, but by and large, as a generalization, I've been disappointed in the strength of the baby boomer generation in the Lord. I've been disappointed that there's been this wave of great divorce that's hit even my family.
Yeah.
Disappointed in people walking away from the Lord who had been going to church for decades.
Yeah.
And it's sad to see a generation hitting a phase of life that's a challenging phase of life.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that the church has done a good job, and I don't know how to do it because I'm, 20, 30 years younger than that, but like helping people move into that phase of life.
Yeah.
Because I think it's I'm watching this. I just watched my dad go through it before he passed, like going into that end of life phase, but also going into the latter years of life. And I think that's really hard for people. And a lot of baby boomer generation are getting disenchanted with the Lord in that phase.
Yeah,
and
they're
so
the largest generation that walked away from church and didn't go back.
Yeah.
And it is sad. And I do think, years of life don't always equate maturity in the Lord.
Yeah.
And so I think the
and
call,
even years sitting in a pew.
Yeah. And exactly. And I think the call for, any of us who are kind of are like, maybe you grew up in the church or cultural Christian or whatever, that won't sustain you.
Yeah.
And that sort of understanding of that deep root system in the Lord is so important for all age groups. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't discern between age groups. Like, we're all needed in that.
Now that said, baby boomers have handed us a powerful legacy.
Totally. Absolutely.
And some of them are going strong.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Well, absolutely. I'm with you on the wariness. Obviously, we always need to have our eyes wide open.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm with you on the build for the future, but I'm so excited about 2025. And I don't know. I feel like I'm more inclined to be a little bit more cautious.
Yeah.
And especially when I started sensing in the last, few months, the words that I was receiving felt a little bit like prosperity.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, I put the brakes on right away because like prosperity gospel has done a lot of damage. And but if the Lord, if I'm right, I really just feel like the Lord is saying the fruit's going to come easy in this next season, easier than it did. And I think, the last 4 years, we lived through them together, literally.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we lived, we fought, we hung on, we sought the Lord to try and figure out what to do. And there was just a strong headwind, no doubt about it. And the Lord is always for us. The Lord, I've been thinking about the Lord is the rock that we stand on. The Lord is the wind that is pushing us, in the way we need to go. And He's the light by which we see the path, laid out in front of us. So He's always, none of that ever changes. But there are headwinds, I even think I was talking with someone today about Jesus went through His temptation. And then it says in one of the Gospels, it says, and then Satan departed until a more opportune time.
Yeah.
And in some ways it's almost like I feel like, okay, Satan is departing until a more opportune, which maybe that's, you said 7 years. So we got 2 more years until the family, I don't know, like He's going to be back. But in some ways I just feel like there's almost this like dispensation, or I was even joking about the Frozen song where it's like when they open up the gates for the first time in forever, and I just, and I've tried to wrestle out with the Lord because I don't like expectations because I don't like disappointment. Hope deferred makes the heart sick. So, anyways, I'm trying to say, okay, Lord, I'm hearing you, and I'm hearing what you want me to do is you want me to be someone who is excited. And that's probably always true. That rejoice in the Lord always, right?
Yep.
You want me to be someone who's throwing the nets out on every side right now, because of the hope of people, of fish being caught, of people being caught for the Lord. You want me to plant as much as I can, invest as much as I can in your kingdom and all of these things, because this is a, what do you call it, boomer crop? Bumper year. Mm-hmm. And so it's funny because that's literally what I feel. And I've written about that and sent that email. If you want that, you can email me and I can send you out my whole synopsis of that. But what when you were speaking on Sunday, I was like, okay, Lord, so what is the fruit that we should be looking for? If fruit's going to come easier, could you give me a next level of kind of clarity on what fruit should we be looking for? And I really feel like, and this was confirmed with some of your words, some of what Kurt had said and all that. But I think, first of all, I definitely think youth. I think this is a time to really go after the next generation, really go after young people in our own homes, let alone in the high schools around us and in the public. I mean, I think, and we're seeing it in universities. I mean, the Ohio State University, even though they just killed my Oregon Ducks, the whole team was on their knees praying before the game, and you keep seeing all these Instagram things about they're baptizing all these people, and so there's just a lot of those neat things happen around. So I think we should be looking for fruit in there, which means we should also be casting our nets in that direction. Go sign up for YWAM, Youth with a Mission. It's alive and well today. Let's see what if YWAM just booms this year, and there's all these people going to get discipled in the Lord and learn how to serve the Lord. Yes, Young Life. Let's go all in. Young Life. Come on, Young Life. Do your thing. We're with you. And then marriage, I've heard a bunch of people saying that this is a year where, and so what I feel like in some ways, if your marriage is in a tough spot, hear the word of the Lord potentially for you this year. Invest in your marriage. Don't give up on your marriage. Try harder this year for your marriage than you've ever tried, because it could be that you gain a lot. And even in our staff meeting today, I felt like the Lord was whispering that the hardness in marriages will become softness, because marriage can you can become very jaded and hard. But this year the Lord He wants to bring a softness to your marriage, where your wife actually speaks to you in a way that feels soft. And you actually speak towards your wife in a way that's soft, no longer hard. It's like, let's go, let's get after that, chase that thing. Provision for ministry, if you want to do something for the Lord, He's going to supply for that. So make some dreams. One of the, I forget who it was, maybe Hudson Taylor was China. Is that right? I forget who it was in India, but he was like, attempt great things for God and expect great things from God. Was his motto. And I feel like, that's this year. We should really try amazing things for the Lord. And in some ways, the Lord's like, I'm with you. He always is, but I don't know. I just get this different sense. And then the last one, which I'm praying about and seems maybe the most challenging of them all is some of those people who've gone away will come back. And not necessarily in the sense of a prodigal, like they've gone away to just sinful life, but basically maybe they've gone away from you in a way that it doesn't seem to make sense. Or maybe they've gone away from church or the Lord or their passion or the ministry that they were involved in. And maybe it was because of ideological stuff. Maybe it was because of political stuff. But it's like this year, the Lord, He wants us to reach out in those places, and He's going to bring some of those. And doesn't mean back to Living Streams or New City or whatever it might be, but back to Him in a real beautiful way. So I don't know. That was when I was thinking about specific fruit, Lord. What do you want me to look for? Where do you want me to really go?
I have a little first fruit there. I just want to share before I know we'll probably wrap up soon. But in 2021, right? Everybody always grumpy with the Lord, falling off the face. I had a good buddy of mine who had posted some Jesus church, and I was like, this guy, has known and loved Jesus, and I saw that. And of course his comment on Facebook comment section was just all sorts of unhelpful on both sides, people saying, yeah, church, Jesus, and people saying heretic, or whatever. And so I just felt like the Lord telling me to reach out. And so I didn't bite in the comment section, I just direct messaged them and I said, hey, sounds like you were really hurting, man. Can we get some coffee? And it was kind of in that window where you could get coffee with someone, but a lot of people weren't down to, people were still meeting on the lawn a little bit, but but even those people were okay with okay, we'll meet open air or whatever, and so he said, and we went out, and hung out one evening. I went kind of towards him and found out that, and him and his wife were kind of in that a little more COVID concern. So they were still on the more cautious side there. It's probably spring 21 or something like that, I think. And he shared with me that they had lost a baby during COVID pretty dramatically. and to the extent where she had to be in the hospital, and he couldn't be there while that was happening.
Wow.
And he said, "That's what's going on." Like, honestly, and I think all I needed was someone.
He's hurt. He's angry.
He said, "I'm livid with God."
Yeah.
And we talked and we processed through it. And they live in the valley, but not anywhere near us. So they're good friends that we see not as often as our love for them allows. Or would want. But then they recently, this last year, had their first kid came out alive. For sick, I don't know. They didn't miscarry. Yeah. And so we got dinner with them a few months back with their new child, and with Silas, who's maybe a year or so older than their kiddo, and it was so fun to see him and his wife. All they were asking over and over again was like, "What are the things that God is showing you through your child?" Like, that's all they wanted to talk about. And it was so fun to see him, especially who was so angry and bitter, lighting up. "Oh, the Lord's showing me this and this and this and this through my child, and this and this and this."
That's cool.
And they're doing well. They're thriving in the Lord, And anyway, so I
like that.
When you shared that, I just had to share that.
That's definitely what I've tried to, and I'm trying to discipline myself to just jot down. Okay, Lord, you did this. Even when you were talking about the latter rain, it's funny. I just put in my calendar real quick in October. Yeah. When I plant our winter lawn, which we do every year, there's always something like if the rain can come right after you plant, the grass just booms.
You're golden.
It comes. So totally. I'm like, okay, Lord, I'm putting this note in to just think October 29th. I'm like, okay, did the latter rain come for that as another confirmation of this word? Right? So I don't know. It's like Lord, I'm ready. Like I got pen and paper out. Just do your thing. And I just want to record it. I just want to see it. I want to notice it. I want to acknowledge you. I want to rejoice in it. I want to thank you for it. I'm kind of trying to do that right now. Hopefully that'll last. But thanks so much for taking time to listen to us. Thank you, Ryan, for being here. Yeah. Thank you, Alec, for being here. Dalton, as always. And we appreciate all you taking time to listen, but also if you want to share, if you want to comment. I've been getting some emails from some of you out there, which is great. I love it. We have our fasting and prayer and fasting season coming up at Living Streams over the next few weeks. So if you've been listening to the podcast and not coming, we'd encourage you to come jump into the fellowship and community. It's a really cool time of getting together and praying together on Wednesday nights and fasting together on Wednesday days. And then our Sundays to kind of make some sense of all of that as well. So you can come check that out. But with that being said, we'll sign off here and leave you to your relationship with the Lord. Enjoy the weather, and we'll catch you next time.